Hello and welcome. Okay, so I think everybody has control of their own microphones. So we're going to ask if you can mute them to start with. Chat is in the meeting controls. You'll see next to participants, there should be a little chat bubble, and you can ask some questions there. Just a very quick introduction. First of all, thank you all for participating tonight. We had over 40 people register, so I think we hit on a topic that really spoke to a lot of people. We are really thrilled to have Rod share some of his expertise with us over these chat sessions over the next few weeks. And we're going to try to address just the topic for tonight, just on how to pick a camera, what kind of accessories you might be looking for. But we would like to feel free to have people ask questions. If it's appropriate to the topic for tonight, we'll make sure we can try to get those answered in the time we have allowed. And if it's in a different topic, then we will try to make sure that we address those in some of the future sessions. So the next session after tonight is the week after next. So we're going to follow a 2-week schedule, same time, same day of the week. The next one is going to be all about your camera settings. So looking at those camera settings, what do they mean? How do you use them, etc. And that information is already available for registration on the DOAS website. So just so that we don't take a lot more time with me talking, I want to get this turned over to Rod. Go ahead and mute your microphones in the meantime and use the chat bubble to submit any additional questions. We do have some questions that were submitted in advance, and we'll probably cover those within the topic. So Rod, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think one of the most important things when you're trying to decide what to get for equipment, I mean, that's sort of a secondary consideration. The most important consideration is, what do you want to do with it? The range of choices is tremendous. It's tremendous, and you know, on the one end, there are people taking pictures with their phones. I was photographing eagles a couple of weeks ago, and a car stopped. A couple of people got out, and I was using big telephoto lens. It was heavy, expensive, but it worked well for the eagles. They got out of their car, and I pointed out the eagle to them. They started taking pictures with their cell phones. And I would imagine that by the time they got home and looked at the pictures, it would be hard to pick out the eagles, because a telephoto lens, which for wildlife photography is probably the best tool, compresses space. It makes things seem closer than they really are. So I think that regardless of what format camera you use, that's going to be one of the goals. But it's really hard to recommend a particular set of equipment without knowing what you want to do with it. Like I said, there's a tremendous range of options. Briefly, they go from maybe the iPhones or other phone cameras, which take really good pictures, but they aren't very good for bringing or making something appear closer. Up from that a little bit, I think you might want to look at, if you're looking to buy a camera, at one of what are called super zoom bridge cameras. And if you have ever seen, oh, from Afton. His name's, he was our speaker. Rick Bunting.
Yes. Rod, can you lean in a little bit closer to your microphone?
Oh, yeah. Rick Bunting. He uses a super zoom camera, small sensor, and he uses, I think, primarily his pictures for entertainment, education, information, projected on a screen, and it works fine for that. Can you hear me better now? Okay. It
Yes.
works fine for that. It meets his goal. And those cameras are a lot less expensive than a high-end Nikon or Canon camera with a super telephoto lens. The camera body itself costs about $6,000, and the lens costs about $12,000. So that gives you a range. I've seen the super zoom bridge cameras selling for as little as $300 to $500. But without knowing specifically what you're hoping to achieve, it's sort of an open-ended discussion. Does anybody have a question? Is anybody looking to purchase a camera? What are your goals?
Rod, I have a question.
Sure.
What would you recommend as far as the lens size for a digital single lens reflex? Like 300 millimeter, 500 millimeter?
Birds are a tough subject. They're a really tough subject. I do a lot of wildlife photography, but I tend to photograph big animals. So a 600 millimeter lens is gives you a nice space between yourself and something like a bear. To photograph a bird, it's small. I've been trying to get a picture of a hummingbird on a bird feeder. They're fast, they're small. I would say a 300 millimeter lens on a single lens reflex camera would be the minimum that you would want to use. The lens that I use, that I really love, is a Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter sport lens. It costs about $2,000, but it works really well for things like birds because it's a push-pull zoom. And one of the things about photographing birds is you can see what you want to photograph. You've got a long telephoto lens. When you look through the lens, it's hard to find the bird. By the time you find the bird through the lens, it's not there anymore, or it leaves very quickly. I mean, they're tricky things to photograph. Juvenile eagles on a nest are relatively easy, but songbirds like that hummingbird, it's hard to keep up with him. He moves so fast. By the time you get him in the viewfinder, he or she's moved off to somewhere else. The bridge cameras come in two different formats, a smaller sensor and a larger sensor. The larger the sensor, typically the better the quality. The smaller sensor camera, like Rick Bunting uses, they have a zoom range that goes up to 2,000 to 3,000 millimeters in equivalent millimeters in length. That is a tremendous telephoto lens. The problem when you get into lenses that are that long is that you start picking up atmospheric haze, heat waves. There's a practical limit to how long a telephoto lens can be and still be usable. So a 300 millimeter lens would work well on a single lens reflex camera. And a single lens reflex camera, digital camera, basically comes in two flavors. A full frame sensor, which is equivalent to the old 35mm cameras. That's why they call it full frames, the same size, approximately the same size as you used to see in a 35mm camera. 35mm negative was 24 by 36 millimeters. They have a reduced size sensor. Canon and Nikon and Olympus has a micro 2/3, I think what they call it. The smaller sensor actually increases the reach of the telephoto lens. A 50mm, without getting too technical, on a 35mm camera, this is an old film camera, Canon F1. And on this camera, the normal lens gives you, which is a 50mm on a 35mm camera, gives you the equivalent perspective that you'd get if you didn't have the camera. So if you hold up a camera with a normal lens like this, and then you look over the top of it, the subject will seem about the same distance away. The focal length of the lens is a measurement of the diagonal of the lens. So you go from the top left corner to the bottom right corner, and that measurement is usually considered the normal focal length of the lens. So therefore, on a smaller sensor, a 50mm lens is not a normal lens, it's a telephoto lens. So when you reduce the size of the sensor and the lens stays the same, the lens actually has more telephoto effect to it. So although you collect more data, more information with a larger full frame sensor, that 300mm lens, if you have a 300mm lens and compare that to a smaller sensor camera with a 300mm lens, the 300mm lens could be the equivalent of a 450mm lens. So that's a pretty important consideration. There is a ratio that's very significant between the focal length of the lens and the diagonal or the size of the image sensor. It's kind of a complicated thing to explain, without a visual or something to refer to. But I think the short answer would be the single lens reflex camera, not a bridge camera. They aren't single lens reflex. But with a single lens reflex camera that you have interchangeable lenses on, I would get the smaller sensor size with the longest telephoto lens I could afford. And Nikon makes a good lens that's 200 to 500mm of zoom. Sigma makes a 150 to 600mm contemporary lens, which is cheaper than sport lens, 150 to 600mm sport lens, and Sigma does the same thing. I think the 150 to 600mm is one of the best focal lengths for any type of wildlife. If you go over 600mm, it gets very
Ron, just a quick question. Can you explain what the reduced size sensor means that you referred to?
Like I said, if you look at a negative, the negative is what collects the light. In a digital camera, there's a sensor that collects the light. The size of the sensor equates to to the amount of data it can collect with the light coming in. So the smaller you make the sensor, the more you're packing the sensor sites, light collection sites on the sensor. I'm trying to think of a quick way to explain it. I'm going to look and see if there's anything. Do you have that PowerPoint, Susan?
Yes, I do. Any particular page?
I'm going to look right now.
That's all right, I can hear.
I have a quick question, Rod.
Sure.
If you already have a camera, what, you're talking about the size of the sensor and so forth. How do you know, like, what your camera already is?
Well, if you've got the name of the manufacturer and the model number, you can look it up online. That's pretty easy to find out.
Okay, that's a pretty simple way.
Yeah.
I'm going to just do a quick screen share here. This is one of the slides. I'm not sure if this is the right one that you wanted me to.
Slide 6.
Okay.
The one at there, you had it.
This one. Oh, okay. There we go.
If you look at that, and it's easier for me to see on my other computer screen here, the full frame is equivalent to what used to be a 35mm camera frame. It's probably the most popular frame size. It's 24 by 36 millimeters. The DX, which is a Nikon, and the APS-C, which is Canon, have dimensions. I don't know whether you can read them, but they're just by looking at the image, you can see how much smaller they are. So, although they can have the same resolution as the full frame, the little sites on the camera that actually collect the light are going to be smaller, and the image is going to be more susceptible to things like noise. So the quality isn't quite as high, but it's close enough that most people can't tell the difference. So I use the APS-C and the DX size formats with 150 to 600 millimeter lens as sort of my go-to camera. Did that answer your question?
I expect it probably does. We do have a couple of other questions here that I want to just pop out to you. Are needs to photograph flowers different than what you would need for birds?
Very definitely. For flowers, you are getting in close, so you need a lens that focuses closely. A lens with close focusing or macro capability. For birds, you would want at least a 300 to 800 millimeter lens. Those lenses tend not to focus close because the engineering and design and the path that the light has to take through the lens. In photography, everything is a trade-off. If you get one capability in a piece of equipment, you've lost another capability. And if you like to photograph flowers and you like to photograph birds, they're sort of competing goals. Now, a camera that would be best able to do that in one camera, I would think, would be a bridge camera, like the FZ1000. Can't think of who makes it right now, but Canon and Nikon and Sony have equivalent equipment. There's, I don't know if you could show. Can you show the slide before that, Susan?
I can.
It says digital cameras.
Yep. Do you know specifically which bridge camera Rick Bunting uses?
Oh yeah, I think it's a Canon, and I think it's an SX60.
Okay.
That's an older model that's not manufactured anymore, but they have its replacement, which has probably a better sensor in it. I think it's the SX70, but it uses a bridge camera. And if you look at that camera, the second one in on the bottom, that's a bridge camera. They have, as I said, telephoto lenses that are just out of this world in terms of focal length. 1,000 to 2,000 millimeters in length. That gives you greater magnification of the subject.
Rod, what's the difference between bridge and a DSLR?
They call them bridge cameras because if you look at the camera phone and compare it to the ultra compact, the ultra compact, at least historically, had a little bit the ability to take a little bit better quality picture. Then you go up to compact, and the assumption is that the quality is a little bit more. Then you go into the large sensor compact, and so the sensor's grown in size. That gives you a better quality. I'm going to skip over mirrorless for a minute because that's a whole different ballgame. They call it a bridge camera because it bridges the technology between what essentially are point and shoot cameras to advanced amateur or professional cameras, quality cameras. So the bridge camera is one that is in between the compact point and shoot and the digital SLR, which has interchangeable lenses. Bridge cameras do not have interchangeable lenses. That's the biggest difference. But they're usually lighter, they're less expensive. Image quality isn't as good, but it's good enough for most people. If you've ever seen Rick Bunting's presentations, you project it on a screen, you won't notice the difference. If you had a print made, a 16 by 20 print, and then you had one made with a DSLR, a good DSLR, and a bridge camera, you'd see the difference. But at that point, you're doing a thing called pixel peeping, is what they call it. They're the people that get out a magnifying glass and look to see which pixels are sharper. And in a practical sense, that really doesn't matter. And if you look at the pictures that are up on our website, Facebook website, the pictures are really small. Even if you click on them and enlarge them, they're still small. So whether it's a Pro DSLR, a DSLR, bridge camera, a compact, they're going to look the same because that's not the deciding factor. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Next.
We do have one. I'm trying to find it in the scroll here. What kind of light coming into the lens for a digital SLR compared to length is needed so that flash isn't necessary to capture songbirds? Clarification is they have an old DSLR with Canon 1:400 lens, but have difficulty with getting enough light to get a clear photo. How would they address that?
Well, there again, that's a trade-off. if you're trying to photograph a hummingbird, for example, and you want to freeze the wings so they're not blurred, you know, they beat their wings so fast, you actually have to have a flash to control the duration of the exposure. If there's not enough light and you're trying to photograph something with a 400 millimeter lens that's quite a distance away, the flash isn't really going to help you. Light from a point light source, which is what a flash is, falls off at 10 feet with a flash. At 10 feet, you have 1/4 the amount of light from the flash that you have at 5 feet. So the light disperses pretty quickly. So for things at a distance, flash really isn't a good solution. Years ago, I was at the top of the Empire State Building, and there were some tourists up there taking pictures of the World Trade Center with a flash. And their pictures probably turned out okay because the building was all lit up. But it wasn't lit up. Their exposure wasn't caused by the flash because by the time it got to the building and came back, there was not enough light. Did that answer your question? Are you there? Did I lose you?
Oh, I think that probably did. I do have another question in regards to just, can you talk just for a moment or so about digiscoping, which is using a telescope with a traditional camera or a smartphone with an adapter?
Yep, it's a valid way to do it. Spotting scopes have greater magnification than most camera lenses, but they aren't designed for photography. So the optics in them won't perform as well as they would on a dedicated photography telephoto lens. The thing about a lens that makes lens design very hard is that a lens is essentially a prism. And what happens if you hold a prism up to light? All the wavelengths bend at a different angle. So all the pinpoint of light going through a camera lens is being bent at different angles. So in order to make it work correctly, you have to have another piece of glass in there that bends them back. So there's a lot of engineering that goes into a telephoto lens for a camera. That's why an 800 millimeter lens can cost $10,000 to $12,000. Digiscope gives you good magnification if you've got the equipment to do it and you're happy with the results. I think that's what matters. It depends on what your intent is.
We did have a couple of questions that were emailed in advance. One of them was just in regards to the kind of going around outdoors looking for birds. How do you handle ticks? And Londa, this might be a good question for you to actually answer with your beautiful property and being kind of
I just
out
lost
there.
audio.
All right, I'll jump in, Rod. Well, I think it's always a challenge.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
I think one of the things, I wish I knew the name of the product. I got it from, online, and Sandy Bright brought it to my attention, and it's a type of gator that if the ticks are climbing up, they get stuck in these little tiny grooves. And then when you come back, you can actually see the ticks in these gators. And you can throw them in the dryer to get rid of them. My daughter deals a lot with ticks where she lives, and she is a believer in DEET because she has to work out in the environment all the time. But their rule at their house is they take all clothes off in the back room and they go in and they check each other. So I think it's, you know, when you're out birding and you're out with your camera, your focus is on that. And we do tend to kind of forget to be careful. But I think the biggest thing is the protection ahead of time and then the checking afterwards and, you know, looking all those little groovy spots they like to get into.
Thank you. And I know we just as a general practice also, one of the recommendations is after you look for ticks is just take whatever clothes you had, throw them in the dryer for 10 minutes, just to make sure that there are no living ticks kind of crawling around on your clothes that you weren't aware of. So good question, good safety question for people who are out there doing bird photography. I know this is short and I don't want to necessarily cut us short, but I do want to keep us to kind of that half an hour schedule. If you do have any final questions, let me know in chat and we'll go ahead and post those through and just see if we can get a couple of final questions and then I'll come back with an announcement. Okay, I do have a follow-up on the light question, Rod. So they want to keep that 100 to 400 Canon lens. We may have lost Rod actually from, the connection. Hi, Rod. I have you on speaker, so you're being able to hear here. The automatic enrollment is, there was a question if you're automatically enrolled in all of the classes with this one. The answer to that is no, you do unfortunately have to go back and re-register. I do have the link for the next section, next session online. And that is at the DOAS website. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again and bring that back up. So doas.us is the URL, and you'll see it in the upcoming programs list. So we added part 2 over here, your camera settings, and you can just click through to that and you'll find the registration link. I also want to bring your attention, we do have a birding for beginners workshop that we'll be doing next week in collaboration with the A.J. Reed Science Center with SUNY Oneonta. And they're basically, it's, you know, an overview to field markings, bird songs, habitats for some of our more common spring and summer birds. It'll give you a quick overview of binoculars and field guides, and then some of our favorite birding spots. So the registration link is also available there at the website. There is a question about the Sony DSC HX99 and whether or not that would be considered a bridge camera. Do you know that off the top of your head, Rod, or do you have to look that up?
Give it to me. I still have internet here. I don't know what happened to the Zoom, but what was it again?
The Sony DSC HX99. And Margie, I will email you the answer to that one privately through email. Okay, good. And then I think we've got everybody's questions. We hope you find it helpful, and we definitely look forward to seeing everybody at other presentations coming up. So thank you very much.